Welcome back, you scholars of the Enlightenment. I'm here again with Top Gear Magazine's James Bond Q, Ramsey Faragher.
Hello, YouTube.
And today we're going to be talking about autonomous vehicles. So vehicles that are capable of sensing their environment and moving around with little to no human input. So we're going to be talking about machine learning. We're going to be talking about drones. We're going to be talking about Martian rovers. We're going to be talking about driverless cars and all that good stuff. So, we've all seen this exponential increase in the focus on autonomous vehicles. So I'm thinking about driverless cars, which are going to save us from everything from pollution to congestion. And obviously, there's going to be no deaths whatsoever on the roads anymore.
I mean, you know, it's all fine, isn't it? It's all proper. You got a sign. It's all fine.
Oh, yeah, it's all fine.
Drones, which are going to deliver all our packages. They're going to take over our military. It's going to be, you know, Terminator 2 Judgment Day.
Skynet will be in control of your military.
But you'll be in control of Skynet, right?
That is correct, sir.
Martian rover, so NASA's InSight mission just landed on Mars. So what better time to sit down with my good friend and colleague, again, Dr Ramsey Faragher. To give you a quick reminder, Ramsey, like, what's the guy from Wanted's name, the actor? Liam Neeson, that's right. Like Liam Neeson, Ramsey has a very particular set of skills.
Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
So, for those of you who didn't catch our interview on GPS and GNSS, he's an expert in GPS tracking and sensor fusion. So essentially, if you want to know where something is and what it's doing with technology, this is your man. Top Gear magazine branded him the real life Q because he's done a hell of a lot. In fact, I think you said you're the only person that you know of to work on the tracking systems of both a Martian rover and a nuclear submarine.
And a few other things as well.
Well. So, he's also worked on drone systems, and he's a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation. So he's really is the person to talk about these autonomous vehicles. So Ramsey, very simply, first question on everybody's lips, and particularly on my lips as a non-expert, is what are we talking about? What are autonomous vehicles?
So it's an important distinction between simply an unmanned vehicle and an autonomous vehicle, because many of the unmanned vehicles that we hear about at the moment, like the Predator drone and old Martian rovers, traditional Martian rovers, were just remote control vehicles. So you just had a camera link and a radio link.
So even the ones sitting on the surface of Mars, somebody was sat at NASA or wherever else with a joystick, and even with that travel time between...
Well, exactly, driving them very slowly because of the travel time. So if they were, you know, if these things were allowed to bat along at 20 miles an hour on the surface of Mars, then they could do a lot of science very quickly. But the point where the teleoperator turned around the rock, went, "Oh, there's a hole," and pulled back on the stick. A few, whatever the flight time is, put it on the screen. Earlier.
I'll do the
the Martian
time equals distance over velocity calculation and bob it up on the screen for the viewers.
I got your six, boy.
Yeah, exactly. So because of the severe lag, Martian rovers are always trundled along at centimetres per tenth of seconds, this kind of thing.
So when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, there's a difference there between...
Yeah, so true autonomy is that the platform has intelligence and can operate independently without a human in the loop, without teleoperation.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the systems that people hear about all the time, a lot of the drones people hear about, like the Predator drone, they're actually just remote control planes.
Yeah.
Truly autonomous vehicles are much harder to get up and running in the world, because you turn them on and they go, and then they come back later and they've done their job with very little human interaction. So you need to be able to program them to act intelligently on their own
and understand the world around them when they're going about doing their job.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as we'll discuss, in the ground domain, being a car on the road dealing with Cambridge traffic is way harder than flying from Liverpool to Manchester autonomous or something like this. Depending on where you're trying to operate, it can be vastly harder to create an autonomous vehicle.
So even taking that into account, though, it's actually surprising that we've seen this exponential growth in focus on autonomous vehicles. So thinking about driverless cars, the Martian rover, they're actually, in historical context, we've been trying to get these autonomous vehicles off the ground, literally and metaphorically, for quite a long time.
Yes, so we have over 100 years now of autonomous vehicles of some type. So the earliest one I know of is the Kettering bug, which was, its brain was the Sperry gyro. And the Kettering bug was basically a biplane from World War One. And the team at Sperry, who made gyroscopes, replaced the pilot with a very large spinning disc, a proper traditional gyroscope.
Okay.
So you spun this thing up to a very high speed.
So it's a plane without a pilot, just a spinning disc where the pilot would be.
Yeah.
Oh my God, the automatic pilot, it's deflating!
So you'd point this biplane in the direction you wanted it to fly. And so what they would do is launch from their own occupied territory along a vector where it flew over some thing of interest of the enemies that they wanted to look at, like some enemy trenches. But they knew that 20 miles further on was occupied territory again. So they put enough fuel in this thing so it would take off, fly in a straight line and come down in occupied territory. Clockwork, camera or something in it that would take a photograph every minute or something and set it going. And what the gyro was doing was basically locking the platform in that direction.
Yeah.
So it would take off and it would fly, and if a gust of wind buffeted it and tried to knock the aircraft onto a different vector, the gyroscope would still be defiantly pointing in the direction it wants to be going in. And by hooking the gyroscope up to the rudder, as the aircraft was buffered and tried to go that way, the gyro would be doing exactly the same thing as a pilot going, nope, back that way. And it worked. So over 100 years ago, there were spy planes, American biplane spy planes. And most people don't know this.
No, I certainly didn't know that.
And knowing is half the battle.
During World War II, the famous V1 and V2 weapons that were used by the Nazis, they had, for their day, very clever, very intricate navigation systems. So the V1 Doodlebug was basically a cruise missile.
Yeah.
Again, full of gyros, point to the direction you go, fire it off, and the navigation system, the autonomous autopilot within that platform, could do a very good job of keeping it on the straight and level path regardless of the odd gust of wind. Admittedly, the way they decided where to come down was a little less elegant. They mounted a metal disc on a screw inside the platform. There was a tiny little propeller on the nose of the V1 bomb, and you would set this disc for the distance you wanted the thing to fly.
Okay.
The little propeller would twizz around in the airflow, and this disc would very slowly move back on a screw thread, the amount you'd set it to. And at the far end was electrical contacts, and when the disc touched the electrical contacts, a pair of scissors cut the control lever to the elevator, and the thing crashed.
Sounds very sort of Rube Goldberg way to go.
A very clever way of making sure you don't go left and right, and then quite a simple way of making sure you go the right distance.
So I guess with that, the bombs would come down within a sort of circle around where you'd anticipated they would do. So some margin for error at the end, but still quite accurate.
It was an autopilot. Just cruise missiles were the beginnings of autopilots.
And I guess modern cruise missiles incorporate things like GPS and more complicated computer systems, do they? Or
yes, and generally multiple redundancies if you can, multiple ways of determining where you're going and what you're doing. So often they will use things like terrain imaging and mapping as well. So they'll fly as low as they can. Typically they'll fly below radar, so they'll actually ensure that objects are getting in the way, like fly down valleys and then pop out and stuff like that. And they'll use visual radar to map where they are to a map of where they need to go. But yes, nowadays you can use GPS to know exactly where you are as well. But GPS can be jammed, so the more complicated.
So it becomes a bit of an arms race in autonomous vehicles, really.
Yeah, and you need lots of sensors. You know, if you decide you're going to build any autonomous platform, you might as well take us as a good model for what sort of things do you need.
Yeah,
and we don't just rely on vision to get around. As a general rule, we have a variety of other sensors as well, and autonomous platforms also should follow the same sort of pattern, have multiple redundant ways of sensing the environment.
Yeah, and that, I guess, brings us towards the sort of current modern generation, in terms of the military anyway, with drones like Global Hawk and things like that. So how would such a system like that operate?
So Global Hawk is one of the fully autonomous platforms, as opposed to it just being remotely teleoperated. And Global Hawk is a spy plane, so it doesn't have to go in and deliver ordnance, and it generally doesn't have to worry about being shot at or.
So would this be very high altitude?
It's a high altitude spy plane. Global Hawk's predominant navigation technology is actually its GPS, because it's so high up that they don't worry about jamming as much as stuff that is lower down to the ground. But Global Hawk is an example of a highly successful autonomous platform. And one of the reasons that it's highly successful is that autonomous operations in the air domain are much easier than in some of the other domains. So it's
unlikely you're going to smash into a person or a building or any sort of other infrastructure when you're that high up in the air.
As I'm sure we'll get onto, one of the issues with trying to get autonomous ground vehicles working is all of these pesky humans all over the place.
Kill all humans. Must kill all humans.
Bender, wake up!
We'll definitely come into this. We'll definitely come onto this.
The air domain is much more highly regulated. In general, if there is another human flying an object in the sky around you, they've gone through a hell of a lot of training and exams, and they're part of the same ecosystem of filing flight plans and taking it all very seriously and not messing around. And they generally, the air traffic is generally a much better environment to work in.
People tend to know what they're doing if they've managed to get something up into the air.
You're not generally messing on your phone and shouting at the kids in the back when flying around.
Makes sense. So essentially we've been trying to do this for a lot longer than the newspapers would potentially lead us to believe. And we've changed from mechanical systems towards more computing-based systems nowadays, which makes sense. But even within that, have the way that we've tried to do these things with technology changed over time, or are we still trying to do the similar things that we were doing with the V2 or with the cruise missiles that we were sending in Iraq?
There has been a very big change in the last 10 years. So about 10 years ago, when I was first working on these sorts of platforms, the way that you would build the intelligence into your system was very manual. It was if-else case statements.
Yes.
You literally built the logic, and you could have a flow diagram, a decision tree. And if a platform did something unexpected, you could investigate why, and you could debug it, and you could discuss with the other person who'd written this bit, and you could realise, oh look, it's because when that part happens and that part happens together, there's a bug there, that shouldn't have happened. And it's all easily analysed, and you can read every line of code.
But presumably that means that you have to, before you send the thing out, understand every single thing that could go wrong and incorporate that into some sort of if-else statement.
Certainly you could argue that you can only really build quite simple programs in that manner, because otherwise it's just a spaghetti of every single possible if this happens then do that type thing. For that, and I'm sure many other reasons, there's been this shift in the last sort of 5 years to looking at deep learning based approaches, where you have a neural network that you try to train, and while there's huge benefits of neural networks, and we see all of the great strides that DeepMind and others have been making, even just recently in the last couple of days there's been this announcement about AlphaZero, the next step of DeepMind's board game playing brain. Even as we see these advances, we already know there's real issues as well with neural networks that we have to try to understand how we're going to get around.
So just stepping back very slightly for people who might not be au fait with machine learning, I'm very much an amateur in that field. So we're talking here about moving away from those if-else statements and case studies of what could go wrong to actually having the computer learn about the environment around it and what could potentially go wrong and interact with the world to learn like a toddler would learn, I guess, from experience.
So let me explain exactly what a neural net is doing and why it's so different. So at the heart of neural networks are neurons. And a neuron is simply a weight. It's a number that changes its input by some amount, right? So you might have a neuron which, whatever number comes in, it turns it into a very small negative number, or it might turn it into a very large positive number. It's a scale factor. And on its own, it sounds like it's doing nothing, but changing one number into another.
Yes.
But a neural network is a huge collection of these things all connected up together in a variety of complicated ways. A way that has been trained with the data itself.
Yeah.
So no human being carefully crafts what the numbers should be and which neuron should connect in which manner to which and so on. There's a training process that goes on, and people can test different connectivities, different layers, and how the neurons all connect can be part of the training process. But what you end up with is a huge array of numbers. And that's your program. That's your brain, right? It's like the Matrix, where they're looking at like scrolling numbers. It's literally like that.
I don't even see the code. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead.
So we give the computer a load of data, a load of experiences, and then it tries to work out how best to react to those certain circumstances to give an output. For example, if it was a driverless car, how can I minimise the number of times I crash into something?
So a good example is if you take a neural network that's designed to classify images, right?
Yeah.
So what that means is on the left-hand side of your neural network flow of information, you would have every pixel in the image, right? So for every photograph, you scale them, crop them, so they've all got exactly the same number of pixels. So let's say we were going to keep 5,000 pixels from the image, right? So you'd have 5,000 numbers coming into your neural network, and the number is just the brightness of a given pixel in the image. So you've got 5,000 inputs, and you've got all of these connections to all of these neurons, which initially are just randomly chosen numbers. The training process that goes on tunes all of these numbers in a way that no human could manually tune them.
Yeah.
At the other end is your answer coming out of your neural network. So plug in picture number 1, 5,000 pixel values go in, churn through the neural network, and the answer cat might come out with 78% probability, dog with 12% probability, toy.
So the question is, what is this image?
Yeah.
And we feed it a whole set of images, as many images as we can find, and it works out a cat tends to have, on average, this array of pixels in terms of shape or brightness or colour and these types of different things.
Well, so your classic process for training these things is you actually give it loads of cat pictures, and you go, these things are all cats, and it has loads and loads and loads and loads of pictures of cats, and there's this process called backpropagation, which is basically sort of starting over here at cat and working backwards through the neural network back to the pixels to sort of figure out what the numbers needed to be, so that when this particular pattern of pixels comes in this side, you end up working through the network to cat, not dog or sheep or cow.
Yeah.
So the training process involves typically lots of labelling of the information.
So it's a way, it's sort of a categorizer, if you will. It's putting a probability stamp of this being a horse, or this being a cat, or this being a dog.
Yeah.
And segregating between different labels of what an image could be.
Yeah, and the new advance that DeepMind have been working up is reinforcement learning, where actually you set a score and a goal, and you allow the neural network to keep trying to do something, and you just tell it how well it did it or not.
Yes.
So less for categorization, but a perfectly good example of driving a car, right? So if the inputs is all of the information from a camera facing out the front of the car, and the outputs of the neural network are steering inputs and plus and go, stop and go, I should say. You can have a very simple set of outputs for just controlling the car, and you're still feeding in huge amounts of data from all the cameras and everything else. And the reinforcement learning process is you stop it when it does something wrong and tell it how badly it did it wrong.
Yeah.
And you can
so there's a metric for success.
Yeah.
How many buildings did I plough into this time?
Yeah.
Try not to do that again based on the information that is fed in.
And if you do it all in a computer game first, before the real world, it can plough into billions of buildings a day, because you can have a computer game simulation of the environment running way faster than real time.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you can train a neural network with hundreds of millions of years worth of hours driving in a very small amount of time. The problem is, once this thing is trained, we can't say to it, so why are you driving on a green light? Do you understand?
So we can't go through those pre-coded if-else, because it's not that anymore. It's just a huge array of numbers and no real idea how it got through to that process. It's hard to debug, if you will.
Yeah, and it's very hard to check that we understand why it's made certain decisions. And there's loads of examples where it's adversarial AI, as it's called. You'll have academics that try to attack existing neural networks to check how they can break them.
Yeah.
And there's been loads of examples, especially in the image classification domain, where it turns out what the neural network has been trained to recognise is totally wrong. So, for example, there was a good one where there was a really good neural net that could classify horses or donkeys. Right. And what it had actually learned to classify was that at the bottom of all of the pictures of horses in the training data was like copyright horses and hound magazine. Whereas all the pictures
So it's from like Horse and Hound or something with a little copyright stamp on the bottom.
Whereas there's no donkey magazine with copyright statements.
Yeah.
You don't know what it's like to be considered a freak. Well, maybe you do.
And so all the neural net had learned was to pay attention to the bottom row of pixels, and if there was a copyright symbol, it was a horse.
Yeah.
Similarly, there was another neural net that was really good, it seemed, at spotting the differences between wolves and dogs. Turned out what it was really good at seeing was how much snow is in this image. It's a wolf.
Yeah.
And it wasn't actually paying attention to the animal in the picture at all.
So when we put it into a real world example, it suddenly falls over because those distinctions aren't there anymore.
Yeah. So you put a driverless car out into the world, and for some random reason, the first time it sees a little old lady in a Guns N' Roses t-shirt, it runs her over. In the old method, we could go, what happened in the flow diagram?
Yeah.
But in the deep learning method, you've got to go, can we go through the billions of hours of training data and see if there's any Guns N' Roses t-shirts wearing old ladies? Can we try and figure out why we just did that? Does anyone know? So it's much harder to try to understand why a neural network has done something you're not expecting. You simply can't debug it in the same way that you can debug.
So I guess the summary of that is that a neural network, a mind that we're training, is only as good as the data that we put into it.
Certainly any problems with the data, any lies in the data.
Yeah.
So anyone who's mislabeled training data, that's going to cause big problems.
Yeah.
But it's beyond just it's only as good as the data. It's also only as good as our understanding as to what this thing might be pulling out of the data.
Yeah.
And we often don't know.
So we see just examples that I've seen on the internet. So we see examples where there was the chatbot. I think was it from Google?
I think Microsoft's
chatbot, where they put it onto Twitter, and then obviously the training data is supposed to be people talking to it in a friendly and jovial manner, and within a day it's saying gas the Jews or kill everyone because people are feeding it as much garbage as they can to try and break it. So an example of where the data, putting in poisonous data, I think you said putting in a flaming dumpster fire in, you get a flaming dumpster fire out. So you have to have the correct data to be able to train these things.
Neural networks are like toddlers. They trust and believe the information they're being given as being correct and how they should behave.
Yeah.
So that chatbot that was turned off after one day was exactly the same as putting a little toddler in front of Twitter and people finding it funny to teach a toddler swear words.
Yeah.
And this is the issue with...
Which is why we have an age limit on Twitter, I guess.
Well, indeed. But it's also the issue with the self-driving cars thing as well. You're dropping this sort of toddler grade, I trust the information coming in to be trying to help me out.
Yes.
Whereas, is that really how people are going to behave with autonomous vehicles? Are they going to try to help them out, or are they going to try and run them off the road?
They're probably going to jump in front of them, or I think you mentioned before we started, they'll see it coming along with its LiDAR on and think, that tried to steal my job, and hoy a rocket at it or something. So it actually has to be more sensitive to edge cases as well as things that we think of now when driving a car.
Yeah, I think the point I was making there was that if we train autonomous vehicles today with data that comes in to human-driven vehicles or a synthetic environment, that might not actually be the way the world does behave to these autonomous vehicles, and so they won't be learning things the right way. An extreme example is indeed that you might find people are throwing bricks at autonomous vehicles more than they do at human-driven vehicles. Yeah. If I'm being cynical, perhaps, about the number of people who might be ex-taxi drivers throwing bricks at autonomous taxis.
And there's tons of examples like this. I mean, you must have seen these ones where they run a neural network over a cookbook, for example, and it comes back and it says, cheesecake or something, because
as the ideal meal.
As the ideal meal for someone, which, to be honest, by one metric of taste, it probably is a great meal, but I'm probably going to be dead in 5 minutes. Right? I mean, look at some of these examples that came out when they ran over the cookbook. Beef soup with swamp beef and cheese, chocolate chops and chocolate chips. Sounds good. Should probably be a meal. What have we got?
So what was this neural net doing?
Whole chicken cookies sounds pretty good for the old, working out.
But so had they taken a cookbook, harvested all the words, and asked the neural nets to predict
what would a human want
title of a
for a
recipe?
perfect meal? Yeah,
Right.
What would be the perfect recipe for a human meal?
Needs more data. This is one of the things about neural nets. They need an awful lot of training. So if
The one cookbook, Mrs. Beaton's cookbook, ain't gonna cut it.
No, I mean when you look at sort of the deep mind examples of playing computer games or playing board games to then be better than the human. When you look at how many games they play like millions of years worth of games for a human.
Like me.
And so you're going to need many more cookbooks to train that thing on for it to actually be any good at predicting a good recipe.
Yeah. So it's a silly little example, but highlights that problem. Can you give it enough data, and can you give it enough data to think about and reason around all the particular situations that it will come up with in a real life scenario? That's the big problem.
Yeah. And do we even fully understand how to train them properly? Yeah. I mean, if you consider the example of bringing up a child, most parents probably might tell you that by the time that child was in their teens, the parents had finally got the understanding of how to bring up a child.
And we're going through that same
We're going through that
process
period still of how do we build these things and train them well and things like that.
Makes sense. Still. Let's move into some specific examples. So driverless cars is a big one that's had a lot of press recently. Why the hell do we want these things? What's wrong with my little VW Beetle and pottering around myself? What are the advantages of these things?
So there's been a few examples cited in the past. Reduction in accidents, because there's evidence that most car accidents are being caused by tired drivers, so you won't have tired drivers. There is a big push on the economics side of things, the argument being that we waste an awful lot of time sitting on our commutes and not being able to work properly.
Yes.
So the idea that you could all sit in your car and work on the way to work and back. However, maybe people will just sleep or watch TV. But sleeping is also important.
Yeah.
So that would also be a good thing for the economy if people slept more, perhaps, especially people with young children.
Although I do quite like the idea of I'm getting on a train or getting on a bus, I can get out of doing a little bit of work, which is now going to disappear because the boss knows, hang on a minute, I know you're not driving.
Well, indeed, it's this double-edged sword.
Yeah.
There's some people really keen on people working in their cars.
Yeah, of course.
And there's
the bosses
who might want to just sleep instead. So there are going to be the interesting benefits. Congestion is an interesting one, arguments about congestion, because when we've held events at the Royal Institute of Navigation on these topics, we get people from all sorts of different backgrounds and disciplines discussing the topics. And some of the most interesting talks on autonomous vehicles and the impact on the roads have not come from the technologists. They've come from people like behavioural psychologists. And one of the sort of underlying things to remember is that human beings are all in general quite selfish. And once you start to factor this in, there's an interesting impact on congestion. So if everyone is sitting in an autonomous vehicle and they're not actually paying attention to what's going on outside the windows, they're watching Harry Potter or sleeping or working, it might even be the case that you can't even see outside, right? Yeah. It's a nice relaxing scene of a beach or something that you're surrounded by. And there's just the time it takes to get into the office. Then in that world, then people who are pedestrians at the side of the road might not ever bother to wait for the green man at the traffic lights. In fact, they might not bother to cross at pedestrian crossings anymore at all. In fact, they might not be very happy about the fact that there's so many slow walkers and tourists and people clogging up the pavements, and actually they'll walk in the road.
Yeah.
And there is...
knowing that these cars are going to stop.
Yeah, and that there's no angry taxi driver or angry bus driver going to be honking the horn and swearing at them. Autonomous vehicles are not programmed at the moment to swear at people or honk horns at people or give people interesting finger-based signs out the window.
So even though the suggestion is that they could be this panacea for congestion because they're going to route around and they're going to avoid one another and therefore pollution's going to go down and all this thing, it could actually be that in the real world getting in the way of science again, that people see these things and they think, I know they're going to stop, whereas an angry taxi driver wouldn't, and congestion skyrockets because people just start, as they do in Cambridge just outside Queens, wandering into the middle of the road, knowing that a human is going to make the moral judgment, actually I don't want to plough down 5 tourists to keep going.
Cambridge near colleges is an excellent example where there's often tourists in the middle of the road taking photographs because that's how they are framing their shot. And cyclists angrily swerve around them, buses beep at them and so on and so forth. The question is, in 25 years time of all autonomous vehicles, will it just be gridlock because tourists will just be stopping every single autonomous vehicle? Another good example of this actually is on the actual operations of autonomous vehicles in cities. There may be examples where, because of how badly a city might be designed at the moment, it might not be possible for autonomous vehicles to operate properly anyway without breaking the law. And I can give you an example of this. Again, here in Cambridge, there's a street right in the middle, an important road right in the middle of the city called Regent Street, where one direction is all traffic and the other direction is a bus lane only. And there is a solid white line dividing the road. And technically, you are not allowed to cross a solid white line. If you're currently being obstructed because the car in front is stopped for some reason, you're supposed to wait. You're not supposed to break a solid white line. You're supposed to pretend it's a wall. Reality, all the time there is stuff parked up on Regent Street, delivering stuff, picking stuff up, taxis doing things, trucks unloading goods into shops.
So you have to break the white line, otherwise you couldn't move anywhere.
Every day, all the time, there are vehicles breaking the white line because there's other vehicles also doing stuff they're not supposed to be doing, parked on double line lines, etc. And in a mixed mode world where there's going to be some autonomous vehicles and some driven vehicles, if this continues, if we have selfish drivers behaving selfishly on the roads, well, autonomous vehicles will either cause huge congestion by refusing to break that white line and just clog up the entire city,
or be required to have some hazy,
to break
make some easy legal judgments.
Another good example is that sometimes on motorways, in order to safely deal with the situation, you may have to sometimes exceed the speed limit. So an example is that if a vehicle starts shedding a load, for example, sometimes braking and trying to manoeuvre is not going to prevent the load being shed from hitting you. You actually need to swerve away and accelerate and try and get as fast as you can away from the situation and get yourself out of the direction of stuff. And so, and we might come on to morality of
I think we're going to come on to all of these problems
versus breaking the law and stuff for autonomous vehicles, but you can easily envisage cases where an autonomous vehicle has to break a law in order to prevent its occupants from being killed.
So the idea behind these things is that they're going to stop congestion, they're going to reduce pollution, they're going to reduce deaths, but in reality there's a lot of things we have to work out in real world terms before we get to that point. And I think we're going to come on, as you say, to a lot of the moral problems, a lot of the infrastructure problems. Before we get into all those, horrible ways that these driverless cars can go wrong, how do they actually operate? So I think there's a couple of schools of thought, isn't there? There's the Google and Uber way of doing it, and the Tesla way of doing it, LiDAR and non-LiDAR. And what are those for our viewers? And for me, actually, because I'm not an expert on this topic.
So these are the replacements in the vehicle for human sensory inputs. So we have eyes and ears, and we actually have accelerometers and gyros built into us in some manner to feel acceleration, braking, and twisting.
In our eyes and all.
Exactly. You feel through the seat of your pants if the wheels are starting to slip and you're starting to skid, and so on. So obviously autonomous vehicles need to replace these human sorts of sensory inputs. So cameras are obviously highly analogous to our own eyesight. But then you can choose to use infrared cameras, which can see better at night than we can with poor illumination. LiDARs, that's basically a laser version of a radar. So that's spraying laser light out into the environment.
So these are these big boxes that we see on the top of these
So for
driverless
sort of
car.
R&D vehicles, you'll typically see a big spinning upside down litter bin sort of looking object. They're very expensive as well. They're a very expensive litter bin. They're typically more expensive than the car. So this is
another way people might interact with them, trying to rag the LiDAR off.
Yes, we can discuss the issues of whether unmanned autonomous vehicles are just going to be stripped for parts every time they're stopped at traffic lights. But these are a way of sensing the environment, and they can provide a very accurate high-resolution image of the environment in depth and angle. So you literally build up what's called a point cloud. You build up an understanding of the 3D objects around you in space.
So it's just like sort of radar imaging, or sonar imaging, like a bat would use to make a picture of the world around.
And typically the important difference between the LiDAR and the radar is the resolution. So the wavelength of radar is much longer than the wavelength of laser light, and what that means is radar images are much fuzzier. So radars are very good at accurately telling you any speed differences, but they're very poor at reporting exactly where the
any sort of distance
is.
Resolution.
Well, the worst one is the angular resolution.
Okay.
So if you're driving along with radars running, they're a very, very good way of reporting to you very, very quickly if something in front of you has braked hard. They're okay at telling you how far away that thing in front of you is.
How far the German bombers are from the coastline or whatever.
At telling you the exact edge of this thing. And so things like street lights and litter bins and stuff on the pavement to a radar are just a blur, a smudge in the world.
Some sort of wide
may or may not be. May or may not be in your lane. And so radars alone can't be used for collision avoidance because cars would never drive anywhere. They'd go, oh, that light post is
that smudge is potentially in the way.
I can't go anywhere. So you augment with sensors that are better at discriminating how wide or narrow an object is. Cameras are very good at doing that, but LiDARs are very good. And so LiDARs don't require any external illumination. They give you depth very well. Cameras don't give you depth as well. So
the spinning is to get that 360 degree.
The spinning is literally, it's spinning a fan beam with it like this. So you've got a swath of lasers giving you all of your elevation information, and you just spin that around. But the problem with LiDARs is that rain, fog, dust, spray all cause a return. So if it's raining,
so you get a reflection of that.
You've got
light.
These glimmers of apparent stuff that you might hit, but it's actually just raindrops. Similarly, dust being kicked up, it looks like a wall as well. But to a camera, you can't see through the dust. But radars can see through dust, and long wavelength infrared cameras can see through dust. So the ideal is you have, as I've always called it, a hedgehog of sensors. Just a picture of like a vehicle that's like a hedgehog, the amount of things coming off it. Then you've got all of these complementary alternative failure modes and stuff. And GPS is a very good sensor for allowing you to confirm whereabouts you are in the world to then turn on other parts of the system.
So you have those redundancies between different sensors. So I might see a glimmer, but the radar goes through that glimmer, so it's probably rain, for example. The interaction between those two different sensors can give me more information about what I'm dealing with than the one sensor alone.
And driving along on the motorway and a stone gets kicked up and smashes the camera lens, it's going to be useful if there's more than just that one camera lens that allows you to deal with that situation. And hopefully you don't have to stop at all because there's other redundant sensors. But if you had an autonomous vehicle that just had one camera on it and that's how it got around the world, then you're going to be in trouble the day you get mud splashed up on that, or a cracked lens, or a dead fly, a big dead fly.
Big dead fly.
So you have to have some redundancy in the sensors, and some autonomous vehicle companies are going for different sensor sets than others because one of the drivers is cost. And right now the LiDARs are very, very expensive, or at least the traditional LiDAR system, the big spinny one on the roof.
So I think
very
Tesla uses a non-LiDAR system.
There's no LiDARs on Tesla, it's cameras, and I believe there's radar systems as well. It's mainly camera based.
Yeah.
They do a lot of the sensing with cameras.
It would be nice to think that technological problem has been solved, but there's been quite a few accidents with these things. And people don't react utilitarian to these things. So people don't react and say, well, there's less crashes with the Uber driverless car than there are in LA with normal drivers. They think there's a car with nobody in it driving around and it's running people over. Mm-hmm. We've had the Uber crash recently in the summer. I think we had a Tesla crash. What's your feeling about why those things happened, and how can we get to a stage where we iron out those bugs in the technology?
So the most important thing is again to look at how the aviation industry works. That's our gold standard. It's a very expensive model, but we should use it because it's clearly a very good model, because travelling in an aircraft is the safest way to travel.
Yeah.
And what happens there is that whenever there is an accident, there's a huge investigation, and effectively the policy is we will make changes such that particular accident can't happen in that way again.
Yeah.
And changes occur. So these different companies all have to share their information around what their failure was, and there has to be this global outlook of we must all progress the capabilities of these platforms together, and no one should die in vain in an autonomous vehicle. Is the way we should view this. The accidents that have happened so far are an example of how difficult the sensor fusion task is, and how difficult it is to replace a human understanding the world through whether you believe in evolution or whether you're a creationist. Either way, you believe that a huge amount of work has gone into creating how we work, and how we can interpret the world and understand it and make decisions. And there's still an awful lot of work to be done to make autonomous vehicles understand their sensors as well as we can understand ours. In the case of the Tesla and the Uber crash, if I do them quickly, so the Uber one that happened most recently, a lady was crossing the road in the dark with a bicycle.
That's right, yeah.
In a very poorly lit part of the city.
I think it was in Phoenix in Arizona.
Yeah, I think so. And what transpired was that the LiDAR system, so lasers that give you a very good understanding that there's something there at a certain distance and angle, the LiDAR picked her up as it was expected to have done so. But the next layer of intelligence in the system was classifying and understanding what it was seeing. So the problem with LiDARs, the way that LiDARs can fail, can give you false positives, is not only do they pick up an actual object of interest in the environment, like a bicycle or a car or a wall or a light post, they also pick up dust and rain and snow. And these things also reflect back and appear to be an object at the distance of that raindrop, that speck of dust, that snowflake. So unfortunately, because that is possible, any classification algorithm that runs on the LiDAR data has to solve the problem of, is this a cloud of dust? Is it raining? Is this rain? Is this snowflakes?
And should I just keep going?
Is this a plastic bag billowing across the road that I can just drive through? Or is it a lady pushing a bicycle, which it was? Yeah. And it turned out that the classifier that was used was actually flicking between a variety of classifications in the few seconds that this whole thing occurred. So for a moment it was classified as a bicycle, but for another moment it was classified as unknown. And I think there was a third classification going on in there as well. And I believe one of the issues with this particular incident was that they had been trying to dial down the number of false positives they were having. So in other words, a plastic bag or some dust being kicked up, making the vehicle brake and come to a stop, and it was just a plastic bag or it's just a cloud of dust. Yeah. The vehicles were stopping too often, and they'd been
could also have some dangerous implications if it's slamming the brakes on, I guess. At a high speed. And the issue was that they may have been going through a tuning process, which perhaps
they should have done not on public roads,
yeah.
and nail their false positive, true positive stuff in safe test environments.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that the reason the accident happened is that the safety driver wasn't doing their job properly, because it was accepted that the safety driver, had they been paying attention in the manner they should have been paying attention, could have prevented the incident from happening. But there was evidence that they weren't paying attention to the road.
They were downloading some TV program or something. I think was the story.
And this is the problem as well. When the safety drivers get so bored because the platforms seem to be working so well.
Yeah, that's when those edge cases come in. Yeah.
If it's a 1 in 1,000 event that the safety driver might have to take over, then they might have to sit there for 2 years before they have to take over, right? So that was that issue, and it boils down to particular sensors having particular failure modes. So what you have to do is combine the data from all the different sensors in a complementary manner to try to make the classification problem much easier.
Yeah.
But that's expensive. The more sensors you have and the more complicated the ways you have of combining them, the whole cost of the platform goes up, and the time it takes you to deliver a platform goes up. In the case of the famous Tesla crash that happened many years ago, this was a person who basically drove under a truck that was blocking the road and was decapitated. And it's important to note that Tesla have never said, this is a self-driving vehicle. Tesla have always said, you must have your eyes on the road, your hands on the steering wheel, you're paying attention. This is an aiding system that can keep you in the lane and assist your driving. But people aren't using it like that. And I believe there was some evidence that this particular chap was watching a movie on the entertainment system in his car, and might not have been looking forwards. Certainly what happened was there was a truck across the road for some reason, either broken down or failing to move very quickly, and the Tesla ploughed straight under it. And what would have happened here is the Tesla doesn't have LiDARs.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have had a laser-based system informing the rest of the car that there was a wall in the way, coming at you very quickly. The Tesla uses a combination of cameras and radars. The problem with radars is they give a very fuzzy understanding of the world. What they are best used for is when objects are already moving together at a similar sort of speed. So they're very good at determining if something that seems to be static relative to you, because it's sort of roughly your speed in front of you.
We're changing relative position between those things.
Yeah, so it seems to be consistently at some distance in front of you, and there's a small relative speed. Yeah. Suddenly, if that relative speed dramatically ramps up because they've slammed the brakes on, radars are very good at detecting very quickly that change in speed, and that's how active cruise controls work. But radars have a very poor angular resolution, so everything looks really fuzzy. So when you're driving along,
because the wavelengths are so long, I guess of the
so LiDARs, the wavelength of light is much shorter than the wavelength of the radio waves that are used for radars, and so in the case of radars on vehicles today, when you're driving along, and all of the stuff that's say you're driving along at 50 miles an hour, so all of the stuff that's static in the world around you appears to be coming at you at 50 miles an hour, and then there's stuff that seems to have a small relative speed relative to a few miles an hour, and that's the stuff that's driving.
It's a car moving, or it's a person walking across the road. Or
and what the radars do is they keep stuff that seems to be at your sort of speed when you're up to speed.
Yeah.
Anything that is whizzing past at your speedo speed, it just deletes from the world. Yeah. Because otherwise it seems to be blocking the road.
Yeah.
The angular resolution of a litter bin or a lamppost is so poor that on a radar,
it seems to be smearing out into the middle of the road.
And a purely radar-based system wouldn't go very far.
Yeah.
This was the issue in this instance. So the radar deletes stuff that's static with respect to the earth, which this truck parked across the freeway was.
Just parked in the middle of the road is.
So while the radar is going, there's something huge here in front of you coming at you very quickly. The next bit of logic goes, yes, well, it's static with respect to the earth, so we don't worry about that stuff. So radar deleted it, and so the system was then left with the camera information to try to interpret the scene. And I believe the issue was the pale sky or sun in the way, pale truck. Basically, the camera system did not interpret the information correctly as something parked in the way, a large object that you're going to hit. It could have been even something as complicated as, or unfortunate as, perhaps the truck was interpreted to be a bridge, but the system didn't understand how tall a Tesla is. And thought, well, I go under bridges, that's okay.
Yeah.
And it might not have been doing any of the maths on.
Yeah.
It's
got the right shape, so it's probably a bridge.
Exactly. I don't know, I'm speculating there.
Yeah.
But I do remember that basically once you'd deleted it from your radar information, and if your camera could not correctly interpret the scene, then the human really needed to be paying attention, and the human was not paying attention, so the human died. So the important thing is that in each of these cases, just like in the aviation industry, where everyone says, we must learn from this, we must do better, we must figure out how that accident will never happen again if those particular sequence of events happen again. Then the autonomous ground world can excel and become the best and have a very, very, very low death rate in the future by ensuring that no death is in vain and that we change how these systems work so that that particular accident can't happen in the same way again.
So it seems like we have to accept that these edge cases are going to occur if we proceed with these autonomous vehicles. But as long as we learn from those edge cases and iteratively make the things better, that seems like the way to go. But we are going to have to accept that replacing humans and vehicles is going to result in some deaths.
Yeah.
Hopefully it will be a lot less than we would otherwise see.
And if we look at the aviation sector, that's decades and decades and decades of accident, change things, improve, steady improvements.
Yeah.
And we should accept that autonomous vehicles at first will be like autopilots and the safety record of the aviation industry in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And in 50 years' time, it'll be a lot more bulletproof than it is today.
So we talked a lot about cars there. What about drones? So drones, we're told, are going to deliver all of our packages in the next 10 years. They're going to take over all of our defence. Why do we want these drones? What's the big hoo-ha with drones?
So if we're using drones to mean autonomous aerial vehicles,
Yes.
Then we're talking about things like...
Not male bees.
That's probably where it comes from. Yeah, if we're talking about sort of flying quadcopters and flying aircraft that don't have pilots in them, the biggest drivers, again, are economic ones. So if you consider the airline industry, it's a very, very expensive process to train pilots, and they train for a very long time. When a pilot flies you from London to New York, the pilot and the crew then rest for a number of days.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of downtime for pilots, for good reason. But of course...
So again, there's an economic driver of machines don't get tired, essentially.
Yes. And in reality today, autopilots can do the vast majority of all of the flying. In fact, if you're in a modern aircraft like an A380, more often than not, that landing that you go through is a GPS guided landing, and the pilots just sort of sit back and get ready just in case there's a problem. I think they have to do something like 1 in 20 landings to keep it up. But unsurprisingly, GPS guided autopilot landings are smoother than human ones, because the GPS stuff knows where it is to a few centimetres the entire time during the process of landing. So big economic drivers. Same with the military as well, for all of the same sorts of reasons. It's going to be cheaper and more efficient warfare when you don't have pilots in those aircraft.
Yeah.
And in fact, the limiting factor today on the performance envelope of fighter aircraft is the soft and squishy thing in the cockpit.
Yeah.
So I am a perfect build for a fighter pilot, as you can tell.
Girl, look at that body. Girl, look at that body.
Or a Formula One driver, because my heart is quite close to my brain. And when you're pulling 10G in a fighter jet, all of the blood is being pumped into your feet and isn't getting to your brain. And the shorter the fighter pilot, the longer they can pull G's for.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a fighter pilot, if you don't have a pilot, then that aircraft can pull G's as hard as the airframe can go with for as long as needed to, and can keep doing that.
Yeah.
It doesn't get exhausted, blackout, red out, blackout, red out, blackout, red out through manoeuvres.
Yeah.
And they can fly for as long as the aircraft can fly for, and then fly again as soon as they're refueled. In fact, of course, with air-to-air refueling, a fully autonomous aircraft could stay up for weeks, potentially.
So we've got economic benefits, potentially taking the squishy thing out of the cockpit, military applications. I guess we've also got the sort of congestion and environmental effects again of not having a load of trucks stuck in traffic trying to deliver a parcel to Swansea at 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is. So lots of drivers for having it. What are the difficulties? How do we get these things up in the air? Why do we not have them at the moment flying around bringing me my Amazon parcel? What are the challenges there in terms of physics and maybe the learning as well?
So the main drivers at the moment associated with why we don't have sort of autonomous parcel delivery going over our cities and things is that because the aviation sector is so safe and so cautious,
yes,
and it spends a long time deciding if it should change things, all of the regulatory issues are important, and they do take time. Technically, it's possible to have automated quadcopters fly on GPS coordinates between two places. There are some issues to consider around an understanding as to things like how regular failures might be and what failures might result in. Because if you've got a truck-sized autonomous platform and loads of them zigzagging all over London all the time, because it's really cheap and great to do that.
You don't want it dumping something on someone's head or something.
Yeah, you don't want to just up the traffic and have thousands of aircraft flying overhead all day when you know that actually, according to the failure rate of the systems, that means that one will come crashing down every couple of months on some bit of London.
Yeah.
So there's those sorts of things to try and take into account as well. Increasing the volume is good for one thing, but it does mean that the risk of something happening will manifest more directly into something happening.
Yeah. So it's a real world trade-off again.
And noise is another one that people don't think of. So if you've got huge numbers of quadcopters delivering parcels all over London, they're not silent beasts. And actually you'd quite quickly have an issue where, while in principle it would be lovely to have thousands of things whizzing around delivering stuff all the time, no one will be able to hear themselves think on the streets below because of the drone of the drones. So that's one of the issues as well. But the main one, I'd say, is regulation catching up. And it's all being part and parcel of this heavily restricted, for good reason.
Was that a pun?
Airspace.
Was that an intended pun?
I don't even know.
You're full of pun.
Anymore.
So, big one is probably the regulation. The technology is sort of ready to go if we wanted to go down that route.
It's much easier to make stuff fly around autonomously than it is drive around autonomously. Because there are fewer human beings trying to do silly things up in the air.
Makes sense. So we've chatted about cars, driverless cars, and we've chatted about drones. And it sounds to me that the drones, from what you've been saying, explicitly and implying, that the drones are far closer to being a reality, flying around our packages, than the driverless cars are. Why is it that it's so much easier to operate in the air than it is to operate on the ground? What's going on there? And what is the biggest step, do you think, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years to getting drones and getting driverless cars off the ground? No pun intended.
So, without a doubt, the biggest difference between flying autonomous vehicles and driving autonomous vehicles around cities is how much of an understanding of the real world those two things need to have. So the biggest problem is that autonomous ground vehicles in cities need to interact with the general public. Flying airliners and delivery packages generally don't have to interact too much with all of the complicated aspects of real world. So
because people would say, I've had an autonomous autopilot system that's flown me from Heathrow to San Francisco, and I watched 3 films and I fell asleep, and no problem. So what's going on the ground, I guess, is the problem.
When the aircraft's in the sky, the probability of interacting with anything else is incredibly small, right? And you don't interact with really weird things. You don't. An aircraft doesn't roll off the taxiway and turn onto the runway, and there's a broken down truck on the runway, or an old lady crossing,
or a load of protesters
with no lights on at night, or all of the above, right? So not only is the sky highly regulated, but at both ends,
don't give them ideas for these rocket pack protesters now. Anyway,
at both ends of the journey, the last bit, getting off the runway and getting back onto a runway, that is also a highly regulated, highly secure area. There's no randomers knocking about on the runway. Whereas, bring it down to trying to be driven from my home to Heathrow to get on that autopilot airliner, the sheer number of crazy things that might happen that the vehicle might have to understand and deal with along the way.
A cat running out into the road, or a drunk, or somebody struggling with a dog, or whatever it might be.
So the most important thing for me is, if you think about it, we take a driving test at 17, 18 or higher, or like you, never.
I took it, I just didn't pass it.
And then did you decide driving is...
Well, so I had this arrogant attitude.
Are we digressing?
No, it's fine. I had this arrogant attitude where I was like, at 17, I don't fail tests.
Doc, what if we don't succeed?
We must succeed.
Right? I don't fail tests. And I think, well, this is posthumous reasoning, hindsight 2020. I think my reaction must have been, as a stupid, immature 17-year-old, I don't fail tests. I'm not doing your test again. And I just sort of never bothered again. And then obviously you come down to Cambridge and nobody's ever going to learn to drive in Cambridge because it's just a nightmare.
Yeah.
So then my life has been Cambridge, London, Cambridge. And it's only now that I've gone back to Leeds where it's like, wouldn't it actually be nice to be able to drive around?
And I think this is making my point. There are not people with your sort of attitude in airliners. There are people with your sort of attitude on the pavement, on bicycles, crossing the road, in other cars texting when they should be driving.
Say it, Ramsey,
so
dickheads.
So selfish is what... No, I didn't mean you're selfish. I meant that one of the issues that driverless cars will have to deal with is selfish, stupid, drunk, all of these labels you can attach to people in the environment that have to deal with. And one of the reasons that age 17-ish or so on, you can pass your test is not just because you can prove that you could operate a car at that age. There are 4-year-olds that win go-karting competitions that can drive better than some 17-year-olds. By definition, they've just beaten all of the others. But it's not just the ability to press the pedals in the right order and keep it on the road. You are expected to have an understanding of the world that you bring with you into that platform to allow you to react to stuff that isn't on the test in a sensible manner and transfer your knowledge from life to the road. So, for example, if I'm driving along and I see someone staggering on the pavement, I only have to see a fraction of a second's worth of it and think, this person might be ill, they might be drunk, but that doesn't seem normal, so I'm going to slow down, might give them a bit
possibility that they might wander out into the road unexpectedly.
Yeah, check other things around me, pay attention to this, because this person might fall and roast them in the road. All autonomous vehicles today would just go green box, pedestrian on the pavement, fine, and just carry on as normal. Similarly, you might see someone struggling to keep a dog on a lead, and the dog might be straining and desperately trying to run across the road. Same. You pay attention to that. You understand, because you understand what dogs are and what leads are. You understand that there is a chance that you can predict the future. A dog might run out at the last minute, so you plan for that. Whereas, as I've just said, all of the existing autonomous vehicle systems will just go, it's on the pavement, fine, and carry on going. There's a lovely example. We might be able to try and track it down and show the video that I've used.
Yes, I can cut it into the in the post processing.
There's a lovely example I can show, which I've used many times before, of what looks like a beautifully open bit of motorway, except for at the side of the road a massive petrol tanker on fire, right? And you wouldn't drive past that. And indeed, no one in this video is. everyone's stopped on the motorway waiting for the fire brigade to come and deal with this explosion that's about to happen in front of them. Autonomous vehicle, LiDAR says go, camera says go, radar says go, go. And similarly, if there'd been oil or petrol flowing out of that thing across the road, you definitely wouldn't go anywhere, right? You wouldn't go across that. Autonomous vehicles would. They have no concept, no training, no understanding. Here's the next level of this story. That could be a movie poster of a tanker on fire with an advert saying we should all switch to electric vehicles. Oil tankers are dangerous. And we can look at that and go, it's just a movie billboard. But an autonomous vehicle's camera might not be able to tell the difference between a real truck at the side of the road on fire and a movie advert board of one. So there's all of that.
So even when we try to make that improvement, there's still very difficult steps towards having the car understand what's actually going on outside of the very simplistic task of driving. There's all other sorts of things that we draw in as humans from our experience of the wider world that help us be good drivers.
The world is a messy place.
And in a way, I guess that flows into why we now have that hazard perception test along with our driving test. So here in the UK, not only do we have to pass the live driving test with the guy in the car, seeing that we can parallel park and all these kind of things, we now have to set a computer simulation test where there'll be a person straining with a dog at the side of the road or potentially someone who looks drunk or ill. And being able to recognise those things outside of just the simplistic task of driving is also something that is very important to be a safe driver out there in the real world. And that, it sounds like, well, obviously that's something that's very difficult to teach to an autonomous vehicle and the sensors and computing that are involved with that.
Yeah. So the easiest step to autonomous vehicles is the most extreme one, where you ban all normal cars, you completely segregate humans from the roads. So pavements now have a big wall, and the autonomous vehicles happily live in these tunnels and never interact with balloons and carry bags.
So we're talking iRobot stuff.
Yes, exactly.
You are experiencing a car accident.
The hell I am!
But that is then very hard. You can't just skip straight to that.
No, it's new infrastructure.
But it's also very hard to operate in a mixed modal world where there's drivers of normal cars, being normal human beings, being selfish, and autonomous vehicles. And all of these issues, as we discussed earlier, around we don't even know how people will react to autonomous vehicles yet, really, in order to train them properly.
So we get a sort of cyclical problem where you kind of have to put them in the world to see how people will react to them, but you can't put them in the world until you've trained them to a certain level that they're not just going to plough over someone who was straining with a dog. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem there with getting these things onto the road. And I think you said before we started the interview, a really nice introduction to a talk where the gentleman said, look, let's just put this out there right now. Driverless cars are going to kill people, and people need to accept that if we have these things, that's going to be a reality of the game of getting these things on the road. I can't remember who the...
So this was Professor Paul Newman, who now heads up Oxfordtica, 10 years ago at one of the earliest Royal Institute of Navigation conferences on these topics. He was keynoting, and he was, let's be absolutely frank. We are not building technologies that will prevent all deaths on the roads completely, because it's impossible to do that. There will be people that still step out in front of cars with that much space, and they'll be hit by them. There'll be instances where it's simply impossible to prevent a collision occurring, or there'll be a mechanical failure of an autonomous vehicle, and the people inside that autonomous vehicle will still perish because it was a tyre that exploded on the motorway, 70 miles an hour. All of these sorts of things, we just have to put it into context that they're not superhuman systems. They just don't get tired, and they don't shout at the kids in the back seat, and they don't still drive to work when they shouldn't because they were at a feast the night before. Sorry, very Cambridge reference there.
No comment.
At a party the night before.
No, understood. So there's also a bunch of sort of non-technical issues, aren't there? So in order for these autonomous vehicles to go anywhere, as you said, sometimes it might be that they actually have to flirt with or actively break the law. So we were talking about the situation where if there's cars piled up on one side of a road, and the law is that we shouldn't break the white line to go round them. In real life, we realise that is a situation where we're going to have to go across the road to go round, otherwise we're not going to go anywhere. It might be that an autonomous vehicle just sits there doing nothing. So
it could be that the lights are broken and they're all on red.
Exactly.
And there's a sign at the side of the road that says ignore the lights.
Yeah. So in a real life situation, these autonomous vehicles are going to have to potentially break the law.
Another good example of perception in autonomous vehicles talking about exactly this, and selfish or silly or naughty humans. A year or two ago, there were diversion signs in various bits of the city because of some roadworks. And
in Cambridge?
Yeah, and some kind soul, don't know if it was a student or not, I'm not going to speculate, had moved one of the diversion signs so that it now pointed into Downing College. So you'd follow the diversion signs that were supposed to take you somewhere else, and someone...
You'd end up in the
nice
college car.
joke.
Yeah.
Well, would all the autonomous vehicles just be going, okay,
yeah,
all turning into Downing College?
Yeah.
Because the sign said to.
Yeah.
It's again coming back to the point of these platforms assume no one lies to them,
yeah,
and assume that the world is lovely and no one messes with them and is cruel to them.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. And so human beings can look at that sign and go, that's clearly wrong, and just ignore it. But autonomous vehicles will not be trained to break the rules, right?
Yeah.
They will be trained to obey the signs, not make a decision about whether they think the sign is wrong.
But there's a very interesting wider argument outside of the physics and the technology of getting this done, maybe more on a moral level, of how these vehicles are going to interact with the rules. So we could say that humans interact, they use a bit of common sense with that diversion sign. Clearly, I'm not supposed to be going into a car park. Clearly, I'm not supposed to plough into a river because the sign says so. How are things like, for example, let's say that these things can talk to one another. How should they react in the instance of a collision, for example? So there's 5 kids on their way to football practice in the back of one autonomous vehicle, and that's talking to another vehicle where there's a 70-year-old chap asleep, and they're going to have a crash. And it's, all the sensors say this is going to be a high-speed crash, high likelihood of people being harmed. Should the one with the old man asleep in it veer into the river, or should the one with the 5 kids in the back veer into the river? We're going to have to come to grasp or grapple with these sort of moral questions as well, and teach these cars how to react in certain moral situations.
Yeah, so this is the classic trolley problem, or a variant of it.
Yeah.
The original trolley problem is the idea that there's a person who can operate a lever. There's a runaway train, and this person operates the points.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the exact trolley problem, but it's something like there are 5 people tied to the line, and if they do nothing, those 5 people will be killed. But if they pull the points, the train will go onto the line with only 2.
Yeah.
And so it's the moral dilemma of, if I pull this lever, I'm killing those 2 people. I caused their death.
Yeah.
If I do nothing, then by my inaction, 5 people die. But at least, I didn't kill them.
Yeah. And then
So
there's various variants where the 2 are 2 babies, or the 2 are someone that you're related to, or
the
kind of thing.
Key thing is, there isn't a
right
answer.
or wrong answer. Yeah.
There is an answer where everyone's happy that everybody is agreed on the answer. Right?
Yeah.
So there'll be these issues, and people do discuss and currently work up an understanding of aspects of the kind of moral code. And you go right back to what we said. Paul Newman's take in that conference 10 years ago was, let's just accept that people are going to die because autonomous vehicles are going to hit them for various reasons, but there'll be a hell of a lot less people, much fewer deaths than there are today, is the sort of logic.
Yeah, so it's a utilitarian approach of less deaths is probably what's going to end up triumphing in the way we go forward.
And there is no current answer that I can give you. There's no consensus yet on aspects of the trolley problem. People are investigating various things, from the owner of the vehicle actually going through a checklist and setting the moral code of the vehicle, and then being asked, you know, in a situation where you could be killed or someone else could be killed, what would you like to happen? Right? And you know, don't let your kids play the settings menu.
I guess in a way, when you get in and drive a car, the way that you behave actually has those settings kind of dialed in. Well, it's just awkward to be asked these things, right?
But also, this is one of the interesting things to come right round again to training of neural nets. So one of the approaches that's put forwards for how these vehicles will learn is that actually, for a while, you drive your car yourself, your autonomous car, you drive it, parallel parks with it, there's cruise control.
Yeah.
But over time, the car starts to offer you more and more autonomy. And actually, it's just learned to drive like you.
Like you, yeah.
So it'll run red lights. It'll do 75 on the motorway. It'll honk at people in the roads. the tourists taking photographs.
There'll be a mechanical arm that comes out of the side and dials up the one finger.
So that's one of the theories as to how
you could get around
the car might learn.
issue.
Not just learn your favourite routes to work, but actually learn to drive like you. And I don't think that one will come. I think there'll be a base.
But I guess that could be a solution or a semi-solution towards a wider idea of who would be responsible in a collision. So it sounds like if you went that way, you could argue that the person who is the owner of the car is to some extent responsible because the car is behaving off the triggers that they've given them. So there's a question to ask as to if one of these autonomous cars hits someone, who's responsible? Is it the driver or the owner of the car? Is it the person who programmed up either the if-else statements or the neural net that the car's running on? Is it the person who licensed the vehicles? Are people going to have to sign a waiver, for example, that, you know, if Tesla kills me, then, well, I was happy to get into the car and we just let the market sort it out. Tesla kills less people than Apple does, so I'm happier getting in a Tesla car, or I'll get in an Apple car as long as it costs me less for the journey. Or how are we going to get around the problem of who is responsible when a collision occurs? And how are we going to deal with how people decide which cars to get in based on their past performance?
Yeah, it certainly is a concerning thing to ponder, the idea that you might have an accident that occurs, and when someone traces through the whole process with all of the software as to what the root cause was, it turns out that some intern wrote a bug 3 years ago that someone didn't check properly.
Yeah.
You know, does that intern who only worked there for a few weeks now get dragged out and brought up in court? It's more likely that there will continue to be the sort of ideas where the entire company simply pays out and simply says, yeah, we will investigate this problem, we'll fix this problem, this shouldn't have happened, here's the payout to the family, and so on. And one of the drivers for autonomous vehicles has been the fact that the increased amount of money that will be generated to the economy by autonomous vehicles, and the fact that insurance companies will be paying out so much less on uninsured accidents and all of the human-caused accidents that happen all the time, people falling asleep at the wheel and all that kind of stuff.
So car insurance might be sort of wiped out by these autonomous vehicles, in the sense that we understand it.
There will still be insurance companies, there will still be accidents, there will still be
for sure
tyres exploding and autonomous vehicles out of control because of it and so on. But
in the sense of personal vehicle insurance won't exist in the way that potentially that we understand it now.
The platforms themselves will still be insured for all of the third-party usual reasons.
Yeah.
What might be interesting is how much damage might occur to unmanned autonomous platforms for the sorts of reasons we kind of discussed earlier. If there's no human there involved, then will people, rip the LiDAR off the roofs at the traffic lights and put it on eBay?
Yeah.
We don't know yet. So there could be unforeseen costs at the moment with insuring autonomous vehicles. Certainly, if you consider if you've got your entire autonomous vehicle fleet rolled out all over the world and it's all the same software build and it's all the same platform, and suddenly something happens and they're just mowing down anyone in a yellow t-shirt for some reason no one understands, then obviously you have to cease the entire fleet all over the world until you solve that problem. And suddenly you've got the opposite going on, where you're generating no money at all while you try and figure out why that happened. Whereas, of course, today that simply isn't the case. If there's an accident, if a taxi firm, if there's an accident, it was that taxi, it was that driver. And you can just go, well, did the driver fall asleep? What was the maintenance like on that particular taxi? Did the tyre explode? Whereas if the software in an autonomous vehicle is behaving in an erratic manner that seems to be the software, and you don't know how long it might take to fix that, and you have to ground your entire fleet, then that's going to be a massive cost. So we don't know yet how the economics will really work, but on the insurance side, the assumption is that insurance companies will no longer be paying out huge amounts of uninsured drivers and all of the human crashes that are going on. And when there is an autonomous vehicle in an accident, it'll be so infrequent that it will be simply taken as read that there you go, there's a payout.
That's something that goes on your bottom line, that I know I'm going to have to pay out so much, but the amount of money I make and the improvement to the economy dwarfs that payout. Makes sense. One interesting thing that came up in the research actually was the training of these in specific situations. So we were talking briefly there, or you alluded briefly there to companies in different countries putting these vehicles into other countries in which they're not necessarily based. So one thing that came up in the training of I think it was the Teslas, or maybe it's all of the
Waymo is one of the
that's right. Yeah. And they trained them all in San Francisco or LA or in the Bay Area, and when they dumped them into London, suddenly they're seeing black Hackney carriages and Routemaster buses and not realising that these are things that exist as obstacles in the road because they've been trained so deeply on, what's going on in terms of traffic in the Bay Area. So this is also something that needs to be taken into account in the regulation of these things in different areas.
It's the same point that we discussed earlier around the quality of the training set, and an understanding of how, if it's a neural net based approach, how it understands the world it's seeing. So traditionally, you'd have had these case statements and if-else logic going on. Your sensors would say that edge is the pavement, these dotted lines are the delineations of the road. Anything in the road is a vehicle or an object that I have to be careful of. And so if my LiDAR and my camera define an object of a certain size, then I'll declare it to be a bicycle or a motorbike. And if it's like this, I'll declare it to be a van or a car. If it's like this, I'll declare it to be a truck. I might have rules about how to then deal with those three categories. But at least in that way that we used to build those parts of the system, any object would be dealt with. But in this example where you just throw all of the dashcam video from YouTube at a neural net and see what happens, you can have these really interesting things where the neural net may not have actually learned what the concept of a car is. It might not understand like we do. It is something that's made up of these structures. It might be something as stupid as it goes, if there's a yellow plate with some black writing in it, then it's a car or a truck. If it doesn't have one of those, it doesn't exist. Right? Those are the sorts of problems.
Going back to your sort of the horse and the donkey separation, where it was using some very small element of the training.
So to very briefly touch on this stuff again, it is worth looking into these pieces of work into adversarial AI, where people do try to find flaws and attack these things. There's been lots of one pixel attacks where you've got a neural network which is very good at recognizing road signs or categorizing different animals and stuff, and it's been discovered that in many instances you change one pixel, sometimes in a way that's completely imperceptible to a human, and now it classifies it as something else. And it's because the neural net has not learned the basic concepts. There's a round thing here and numbers, human numbers are in there. It's a 5 and a 0 that you're interested in. 50 as a concept. It's a number that defines the speed.
We don't care that it's
the neural net isn't learning. The neural net is learning some other stuff. It's learning some statistical properties of the image. Potentially. It depends on how it's been built and how it's been trained. these are the real challenges. It's really hard.
So how do you think these things are actually going to play out in the future? So do you think we're going to ban the private ownership of cars? A lot of pundits have said we're going to essentially, no one's going to have a car, we're going to have these cars flying around, and we have a subscription to Uber, let's say, and we just punch in an app, I want to go from A to B, we step outside, we jump in a car, away we go. That would seem to get around a lot of the problems of the interaction of these cars with private vehicles.
It's quite a complicated question. Certainly the ideal, from the technologist's point of view, knowing that there's all of these really difficult issues with mixed operations and dealing with cyclists and drunk people and people think it's funny to jump in the road in front of an autonomous vehicle and stuff, dogs running across the road.
Yeah.
The easiest thing to do is to ban all other traffic, no human-driven traffic allowed, segregate the pavements from the roads, only all autonomous vehicles allowed, and completely change the infrastructure of how cities work. Then you'd have the issues of...
So I think people don't realise this. It's not just a case of dumping these cars onto the road or the drones into the sky. There's fundamental changes to the infrastructure powering these things, people turning up to fix them if they break down and lock up, that potentially people haven't thought about. It's not just sticking them on the road and making them safe. There's a massive change to the infrastructure in cities and the way people interact with vehicles that's going to have to come along.
Yeah, so no one ever discusses what happens when one of these things breaks down. So an unmanned autonomous vehicle, and ideally that's everything carrying freight, right, basically. No delivery driver needed. Well, right now, if a delivery van or any car breaks down on a junction, then the people inside the car will get out and start pushing it to the side of the road.
Yeah.
Generally, other people will try to help, and that vehicle will quickly be moved to a safe place, and then the long period of time for the AA to come out or whatever occurs, and at least traffic can flow.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting question. What happens when you have a unmanned, fully autonomous platform that has no doors, no steering wheel, no control pedals? It breaks down for some particular reason. Unfortunately, it's broken down while turning across some really important junction in a city.
Yeah.
And it's a delivery vehicle from a different country somewhere in Europe.
Yeah.
Go.
And it just locks up like
no one discusses
like the Batmobile,
what happens,
and you can't get in.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they don't want the LiDAR ripping off the roof or whatever.
Well, you can't make these things easy to steal, or they'll be stolen. Yeah. And therefore, you can't make them easy to
access and move around. Yeah.
As a third party trying to move them. So all sorts of things like that.
So we're going to have
for the future.
Have infrastructure for people coming out to fix these things, refueling them. You know, taking responsibility for the human things that can happen with these.
Maybe we'll have massive autonomous quadcopters just coming in and just removing things.
So you get that nice fusion between the drones and the cars. But yeah, like you said, for the technologists, the best thing would be to sort of have these segregated tunnels where these cars are flowing, and you sort of, like the tube, I guess, you'd sort of step into this tunnel, wait, the car would come along, you know, lock into a little airlock there, you get in the car and away you go, and it doesn't interact with any sort of private vehicles and within that structure.
And that's lovely for people who live in cities and that's their thing. But you're not going to be able to change every single scrap of the country's road infrastructure, all the little pokey little villages around the place, and the Highlands of Scotland and bits of the Isle of Man and all this kind of stuff. So you will still need human-driven vehicles to operate in areas where the autonomous vehicles can't operate for whatever reason. Like, the only way to get from there to there is to drive across that field. Yeah. But everyone's always done it, so no one talks about it.
So massive infrastructure challenges, and challenges of just how we think about our interaction with private vehicles have to come along. It's not just the technology that's the barrier to having these things come along. There's a lot of policy, a lot of politics that needs to be understood before we can...
Right now, step one that everyone is considering is small areas where there is effectively some segregated aspect. So a shuttle run between an airport and a city.
Yeah.
And they're just little autonomous taxis are only allowed to do this particular route in this particular way, and that's all.
And this is sort of baby's first step into infrastructure possibilities.
Yeah.
Just to see how that goes.
In theory, autonomous vehicles could continue to exist in just that mode for a while.
Yeah.
Simply be ways of connecting you from A to B in well understood areas, and basically just removing taxi drivers and maybe bus drivers from this particular section of this particular city.
And then we expand out depending on the outcomes of those trial runs, and potentially over time these things become more ubiquitous at least in the cities.
And if you take autopilots in aircraft as our example of something a stick in the ground for how things might be, there is still a vast number of humans flying aircraft, and they turn the autopilot on and off, but it's still humans in there.
So we're not going to have Skynet anytime soon. Essentially, I think seems to be the underlying idea of that. There's a lot of things that need to happen before that. I know Steve Wozniak was sort of throwing cold water on this idea that these things are five minutes around the corner. There's a hell of a lot of things that need doing in the technology, in the deep learning, and also in the policy and the infrastructure that need to be ironed out before these things are going to be rolled out and going to be commonplace.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Ramsey, for another brilliant interview and a great introduction to the world of AI and autonomous vehicles. And there's a lot of promise, a lot of exciting things potentially coming, but I think you'll agree a lot of work to do before we get there. Do you have one final thought for our viewers on the future of AI, the future of autonomous vehicles, and where we're going with this? Is it going to be all happiness and all roses, or is it going to be death, slavery, and Skynet?
Personally, I welcome our future robot overlords.
And on that bombshell, I'll see you next time.